At the glittering charity ball of Haverford Hall, a priceless diamond earring vanishes, plunging the night into mystery. Was it stolen by the desperate maid, driven by love, the debt-ridden widow, hiding behind her emerald brooch, or the cunning jeweller, with secrets as sharp as his craft? Only Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet wisdom, can unravel the web of lies. In a world of elegance and deceit, one clue, a frayed thread, leads to a truth that will shock them all. Chapter 1. The Glitter of the Ball. The ballroom of Haverford Hall glowed with a warmth that only wealth and festivity could conjure. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen cascades, scattering light across the polished oak floor, where couples glided in a waltz to the delicate strains of a string quartet. It was the annual charity ball in St. Mary Mead, an event that drew the county's elite, their silks and satins rustling in a symphony of opulence. Lady Beatrice Langley, the hostess, stood at the centre of it all, her sapphire gown catching the candlelight as she greeted her guests with practised grace. Her diamond earrings, each a single flawless teardrop set in white gold, sparkled with a fire that seemed to rival the chandeliers themselves. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner on a velvet-upholstered chair, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Her black lace gown was modest, her only adornment a small brooch of seed pearls, yet her presence was oddly commanding in its stillness. She had been invited as a courtesy, her reputation for solving small village mysteries having reached Lady Beatrice's ears. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The way Lady Beatrice's fingers brushed her left earring as she laughed with a portly gentleman. The flutter of a young debutante's fan, hiding a blush. The quick, appraising glance of a jeweller across the room. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, a prop for moments when she wished to appear preoccupied. The air was thick with the scent of roses and beeswax, and the murmur of conversation rose and fell like a tide. Lady Beatrice moved through the crowd, her earrings catching every eye, their value whispered about in hushed tones. A gift from her late husband. One guest murmured to another. "Worth more than my estate," came the reply. Miss Marple noted the hostess's pride, the way she tilted her head to display the jewels, as if their brilliance were an extension of her own. As the clock struck 11, the quartet struck up a lively gavotte, and the floor filled with dancers. Miss Marple watched Lady Beatrice twirl with Lord Harrow, her shawl of blue silk slipping slightly from her shoulder. A young maid, Ellen, darted forward to adjust it, her movements swift but nervous. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the girl, noting the pale hands that trembled as they touched the shawl. The moment passed, and the dance continued, the room a whirl of colour and sound. It was just past midnight when the music faltered, replaced by a sharp, anguished cry. Lady Beatrice stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, her hand clutching her left ear. "My earring!" she gasped, her voice cutting through the chatter. "It's gone!" The guests turned, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity, as Lady Beatrice's fingers searched her gown, her shawl, the floor around her. "I felt it slip during the waltz," she said, her voice rising with panic, "but I was certain it was still there." The quartet ceased playing, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Gentlemen stooped to peer beneath tables, ladies lifted their skirts to check the floor, but no glint of diamond appeared. Constable Harris, summoned from the village, arrived with a red face and a notebook, his authority diminished by the grandeur of the setting. "We'll search properly, my lady," he said, though his eyes betrayed his unease. Guests began to depart, their whispers speculative, their glances darting toward one another. Miss Marple remained in her chair, her expression serene but her mind alert. She had seen Lady Beatrice touch her earring earlier, had noted Ellen's proximity, had observed the jeweller, Mr. Felix Goldman, watching the hostess with a professional eye. She had also caught a glimpse of Mrs. Clara Winthrop, a guest known for her extravagant tastes, adjusting a heavy emerald brooch as she stood near the cloakroom. The earring's disappearance was no accident, Miss Marple thought, her fingers resuming their knitting with a soft, rhythmic click. In a village like St. Mary Mead, secrets were never far from the surface, and a diamond, she knew, could shine a light on the darkest of motives. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Loss. The ballroom of Haverford Hall, so recently alive with music and laughter, now lay under a pall of disquiet. The chandeliers still glowed, but their light seemed harsher, picking out the anxious faces of the few guests who lingered after Lady Beatrice Langley's cry had shattered the evening's gaiety. Her diamond earring, one half of a pair said to be worth a small manor, had vanished, and with it the festive air of the charity ball. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in her corner, watched the scene unfold with the calm detachment of one accustomed to unravelling human tangles. Her black lace gown blended into the shadows, but her eyes, bright and discerning behind her spectacles, missed nothing. Lady Beatrice stood near the centre of the room, her sapphire gown now slightly askew, her hands fluttering as she recounted the moment of loss to a small knot of concerned guests. "It was during the waltz with Lord Harrow," she said, her voice tremulous but clear, carrying the weight of her distress. "I felt the left earring loosen, as if it caught on my shawl. I touched it afterward, and it seemed secure, but now—" She broke off, pressing a hand to her throat, her remaining earring glinting accusingly in the light. The crowd murmured sympathetically, though Miss Marple noted a few glances that held more curiosity than compassion. Constable Harris, the young village policeman, bustled into the ballroom, his uniform slightly rumpled from his hasty summons. His round face was flushed, and his notebook trembled in his hand as he attempted to impose order on the chaos. Now, my lady," he said, his voice striving for authority, "we'll get to the bottom of this. If everyone could please remain calm and stay where they are." His words, however, were drowned by the shuffle of departing guests who, sensing the evening's end, were already retrieving their coats from the cloakroom. The constable's inexperience was painfully evident, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she observed his futile attempts to organize a search. She rose from her chair, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag, and approached Lady Beatrice with the quiet assurance of an old friend. "My dear," she said softly, "perhaps you could tell me exactly where you were standing when you last felt the earring." Her tone was gentle, but there was a precision in her question that made Lady Beatrice pause. The hostess gestured toward the western side of the ballroom, near a set of tall French windows that opened onto a terrace. "It was there," she said, "during the waltz. I remember the breeze from the windows. It was rather chilly." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the area. The floor was polished oak, gleaming under the chandeliers, but it offered no obvious hiding place for a lost jewel. A few guests eager to assist were already on their hands and knees, peering beneath tables and chairs. Among them was Mrs. Clara Winthrop, a widow of striking presence, her crimson gown vivid against the muted tones of the room. Her emerald brooch, pinned slightly askew, caught Miss Marple's eye, and she noted the woman's quick, almost furtive movements as she searched. Constable Harris, meanwhile, had enlisted the help of 2 footmen to comb the ballroom. "Look for anything shiny," he instructed, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. The footman, accustomed to serving drinks rather than hunting for lost treasures, moved with more enthusiasm than method, lifting tablecloths and shaking out napkins. Miss Marple watched them for a moment before turning her attention to the other figures in the room. Mr. Felix Goldman, the jeweller who had supplied the earrings, stood near a refreshment table, his sharp features composed, but his eyes darting about, as if calculating the scene's implications. Ellen, the young maid, hovered near the edge of the crowd, her pale face half hidden by a tray of empty champagne glasses. Miss Marple approached the French windows, her steps measured. The terrace beyond was bathed in moonlight, its stone balustrade casting long shadows. She examined the floor just inside the windows, noting a few stray petals from a rose, arrangement and a faint scuff mark, as if someone had stepped heavily. "Did you step onto the terrace at all, Lady Beatrice?" she asked, turning back to the hostess. "No, not at all," Lady Beatrice replied, her brow furrowing. "I stayed in the ballroom all evening. After the waltz, I spoke with several guests, Mr. Goldman, Mrs. Winthrop, and that nice young Mr. Percival from the Manor." She hesitated, then added, "Ellen adjusted my shawl at one point. It was slipping, you see." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "Ellen, the maid?" she asked, her voice mild. Lady Beatrice nodded. "Yes, she's such a good girl. Always so attentive." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind registered the detail. She had noticed Ellen's nervous demeanour earlier, the way her hands trembled as she handled the shawl. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew that small things often led to larger truths. The search continued, but it was clear that the earring was not in the ballroom. Constable Harris, sweating slightly, approached Lady Beatrice with his notebook. "Could you describe the earring, my lady?" he asked, pencil poised. Lady Beatrice's voice was steady now, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It's a single diamond, teardrop-shaped, about a carat, set in white gold. The clasp is a screwback, very secure. My husband had them made for me in London, by Mr. Goldman's firm." Mr. Goldman, overhearing, stepped forward, his manner professional but tinged with concern. "A magnificent piece," he said. "I inspected them myself before the ball, at Lady Beatrice's request. The clasps are in perfect order." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting tightness in his expression, as if he were guarding a thought. The constable scribbled furiously, then turned to the remaining guests. "Did anyone see anything unusual? Anyone near Lady Beatrice during the waltz?" His question hung in the air, unanswered. Mrs. Winthrop, straightening from her search, laughed lightly. "Really, Constable, we were all dancing and chatting. It's a ball, not a crime scene." Her tone was playful, but Miss Marple noted the quick glance she cast toward the cloakroom door. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. though she was careful not to label them as such aloud. Lady Beatrice herself was an unlikely thief, but the earrings were insured. And Miss Marple knew from village gossip that Haverford-Hall's finances were not as robust as its grandeur suggested. Mrs. Winthrop's debts were well known, her love of finery evident in her ostentatious brooch, and the way she carried herself, as if wealth were her birthright. Mr. Goldman's expertise with jewellery made him a figure of interest. Could he have seen an opportunity to reclaim a valuable piece? And Ellen, the maid, with her quiet demeanour and trembling hands, seemed out of place in this glittering world, yet close enough to act. The constable, growing frustrated, announced a more thorough search of the guests' belongings, a suggestion that drew indignant protests. "Surely you don't suspect us," cried Mrs. Winthrop, her hand flying to her brooch. Lady Beatrice, however, intervened. "Let us be reasonable," she said, her voice regaining its authority. "The earring may have been dropped accidentally. I'll not have my guests treated like common thieves." The constable, chastened, agreed to limit the search to the ballroom and adjacent rooms for now. Miss Marple, sensing the evening's momentum fading, suggested a practical step. "Perhaps we might check the cloakroom," she said, her tone deferential. "Coats and shawls are often tangled, and the earring might have caught in someone's wrap." Lady Beatrice seized on the idea, grateful for a direction. The group moved to the cloakroom, a small, dimly lit space lined with hooks and a single gilt-framed mirror. Coats of velvet and fur hung in neat rows, and Miss Marple's eyes swept over them, noting the faint scent of lavender and the slight disorder of a few garments. As the footman rummaged through the coats, Miss Marple examined the floor. Near one hook she spotted a tiny thread of blue silk, caught on a splintered edge. She bent down, her fingers brushing the thread, and murmured, "Lady Beatrice's shawl was blue, was it not?" The hostess nodded, her eyes widening. "Yes, but I didn't leave it here. I had it with me all evening until Ellen adjusted it." The thread was frayed, as if it had been tugged, and Miss Marple tucked the observation away. She glanced at Ellen, who stood at the back of the group, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly. Mrs. Winthrop, meanwhile, was fussing with her own coat, a heavy sable that seemed too warm for the mild evening. "Nothing here," she declared, a touch too quickly. And Miss Marple noted the way her fingers lingered on her brooch, as if reassuring herself of its presence. The search yielded nothing, no diamond, no clue beyond the blue thread. Constable Harris, his notebook now filled with haphazard notes, promised to return in the morning with reinforcements. "We'll search the grounds, my lady," he said, though his tone suggested little confidence. The remaining guests dispersed, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. Lady Beatrice, exhausted, retired to her rooms, leaving Miss Marple to linger in the ballroom. Alone now, save for a footman extinguishing the candles, Miss Marple stood by the French windows, her mind sifting through the evening's events. The earring's clasp, Mr. Goldman had said, was secure, requiring a deliberate twist to remove. An accident seemed unlikely, yet a theft in such a crowded room was bold. She thought of Ellen's trembling hands, Mrs. Winthrop's nervous laugh, Mr. Goldman's calculating gaze. And Lady Beatrice herself. Her distress was genuine, but Miss Marple knew that even genuine emotions could mask deeper truths. She stepped onto the terrace the moonlight cool on her face. The stone floor was clean, save for a few scattered leaves, and the balustrade showed no signs of disturbance. Yet the scuff mark by the windows nagged at her, a small detail that did not fit the evening's elegance. "People are careless," she murmured to herself, "but not always by accident." Her knitting needles, retrieved from her bag, began to click softly, a rhythm that steadied her thoughts. Back in the ballroom, she took one final look, her eyes resting on the spot where Lady Beatrice had stood during the waltz. The floor was bare, the tables cleared, the roses wilting slightly in their vases. Yet something lingered in the air. A sense of secrets held close, of motives hidden behind smiles. Miss Marple knew, as she had known in countless village intrigues, that the truth lay not in the glitter of the ball, but in the quiet moments after, when human nature revealed itself in glances, gestures, and silences. She returned to her guest room, her steps light despite the late hour. Tomorrow she would speak with Lady Beatrice again, and perhaps with Ellen, whose nervousness suggested more than mere shyness. The diamond earring, she suspected, was not far away, and its absence would shine a light on someone's heart. As she closed her door, the faint click of her knitting needles echoed in the stillness, a prelude to the unravelling of a mystery that was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The Hostess's Tale. The morning sun filtered through the heavy brocade curtains of Haverford Hall's drawing-room, casting a soft golden glow across the mahogany furniture and the delicate porcelain teacups arranged on a silver tray. Lady Beatrice Langley, though still pale from the previous night's ordeal, had regained a measure of her composure. She sat on a plush settee, her sapphire gown replaced by a simple morning dress of dove-grey silk, the remaining diamond earring glinting faintly at her right ear. Across from her, Miss Jane Marple sipped her tea with quiet precision, her black lace shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting resting in her lap like a dormant ally. The room was silent, save for the faint tick of a grandfather clock and the occasional clink of china, a stark contrast to the previous evening's revelry. Miss Marple had risen early, her mind already sifting through the fragments of the mystery. The charity ball's abrupt end, marked by Lady Beatrice's cry over her lost earring, had left a ripple of unease in the household. The constable's bumbling efforts had done little to clarify matters, and Miss Marple, invited to stay for the weekend, felt a familiar stirring of curiosity. She had requested this private audience with the hostess, knowing that the first threads of truth often lay in the words of those most affected. Lady Beatrice set down her teacup, her fingers lingering on the handle as if seeking reassurance. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice steady but tinged with strain. "You've a reputation for seeing through muddles. I don't know what to make of this. That earring, it was more than a jewel. My late husband, Sir Henry, had it made for our 10th anniversary. To lose it feels like losing him again." Her eyes, a soft hazel, glistened briefly, and Miss Marple noted the genuine grief beneath her words. "I quite understand," Miss Marple said gently, her tone warm but probing. "It must be distressing. Could you tell me, as precisely as you can, when you last felt both earrings in place?" Her question was casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching the hostess's every gesture. Lady Beatrice frowned, her brow creasing as she retraced the evening. "It was during the waltz with Lord Harrow just before 11. I felt the left earring shift, as if it had caught on my shawl. I touched it. Here, she said, raising a hand to her left ear, and it seemed secure. I danced again afterward with Mr. Percival, and then spoke with several guests. It wasn't until midnight, when I reached up again, that I realized it was gone. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles giving a soft click as she adjusted the wool. And during those dances, or afterward, did anyone come close enough to touch your shawl or your ear? Her voice was mild, but the question carried a quiet weight. Lady Beatrice hesitated, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her dress. Well, Ellen, the maid, adjusted my shawl after the waltz. It was slipping, and she's always so quick to help. And Mr. Goldman, the jeweller, was near me later, when we spoke about his new designs. He admired the earrings, said they were some of his finest work. She paused, then added, Mrs. Winthrop was close by too during the quadrille. She complimented the earrings, though she was more taken with her own brooch, I think. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest at the mention of Ellen. She recalled the maid's pale face and trembling hands, a contrast to the polished efficiency of the other servants. Ellen is a trusted member of your staff, I presume? She asked, her tone deceptively light. Oh, yes, Lady Beatrice replied, her voice warming. She's been with us nearly 3 years, ever since she came from the village, quiet but diligent. I can't imagine her involved in anything untoward. Her certainty was firm, but Miss Marple noted a slight defensiveness, as if Lady Beatrice were reassuring herself as much as her guest. And Mr. Goldman, Miss Marple continued, he seemed quite familiar with the earrings. Did he handle them recently? She leaned forward slightly, her hands still on her knitting, her posture one of polite curiosity. Lady Beatrice nodded. He inspected them a week ago, at my request. I wanted to ensure the clasps were secure before the ball. He said they were perfect, not a flaw in the setting. She sighed, her fingers touching the remaining earring. I don't understand how it could have come loose. It's a screw-back clasp, not the sort to slip off. Miss Marple's mind turned to the jeweller's words from the previous night, his assurance that the clasp required a deliberate twist. A deliberate act, then, seemed more likely than an accident, but she kept this thought to herself. And Mrs. Winthrop, she said, shifting tack. She seems a lively sort. You've known her long? Lady Beatrice's lips curved in a faint smile. Clara? Oh, years. She's a dear friend, though perhaps a bit extravagant. Her late husband left her comfortable, but she does love her finery. That emerald brooch of hers. She wore it last night, and it's quite the piece. She was showing it off to anyone who'd listen. There was a touch of amusement in her voice, but also a hint of weariness, as if Clara's exuberance were a familiar burden. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail of the brooch. She had noticed its slight misalignment on Mrs. Winthrop's gown, a small discord in an otherwise impeccable appearance. It must be difficult, she said, her voice sympathetic, to have such a loss in the midst of so many guests. But we mustn't despair. Things lost have a way of turning up, if one looks in the right places. Lady Beatrice managed a weak smile. I hope you're right, Miss Marple. I've told Constable Harris to search the grounds today, though I doubt the earring fell outside. It's just so perplexing. She rose, smoothing her dress. Will you join us for breakfast? Clara and Mr. Goldman are staying, and I'd value your company. Miss Marple inclined her head. I'd be delighted, she said, though her mind was already elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of the evening. As Lady Beatrice left to instruct the servants, Miss Marple remained by the tea-tray, her needles clicking softly. The drawing-room, with its polished surfaces and air of old money, seemed a world apart from the village intrigues she knew so well. Yet human nature, she reflected, was the same everywhere. Lady Beatrice's distress was real, but Miss Marple knew that even the truest emotions could conceal a motive. She thought of Ellen, the maid, whose quiet service masked a nervous energy. 3 years at Haverford was long enough to know its rhythms, its secrets. And Mrs. Winthrop, with her debts whispered about in St. Mary Mead's tea-shops, had a flair that suggested boldness, if not cunning. Mr. Goldman, too, intrigued her. His professional pride in the earrings could hide a deeper interest. As for Lady Beatrice herself, the insurance policy on the earrings, rumoured to be substantial, was a thread worth tugging. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and made her way to the breakfast room. The table was set with crisp linens and silver, but the atmosphere was subdued. Mrs. Winthrop was already there, her crimson morning dress a vivid splash against the muted tones of the room. She was laughing with Mr. Percival, a young gentleman from a neighbouring estate, but her eyes darted toward the door as Miss Marple entered. Mr. Goldman sat apart, his sharp features softened by the morning light, though his fingers tapped restlessly on the table. Ellen moved silently, refilling coffee cups, her face a mask of deference. Miss Marple took her seat, her smile polite, but her mind alert. The conversation was light, talk of the ball, the weather, the upcoming hunt, but beneath it ran a current of tension. She listened, her needles idle in her bag, as Mrs. Winthrop recounted a humorous moment from the quadrille, her hand brushing her brooch as if to ensure its presence. Mr. Goldman, when drawn into the talk, spoke briefly of his work, his voice smooth but guarded. Ellen, serving a plate of toast, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, her hands steady now, but her movements quick. As breakfast ended, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need for fresh air. She stepped into the garden, where the roses were still damp with dew, and considered the morning's revelations. Lady Beatrice's account had been clear, but it raised questions. The earring's clasp, the maid's proximity, the jeweller's inspection, the widow's debts, all were pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit. Miss Marple knew, from long experience, that the truth often lay in the smallest details. A glance, a gesture, a word left unsaid. As she walked the gravel path, her eyes fell on a single rose petal, crushed underfoot, and she paused, her mind turning to the scuff mark by the French windows. Carelessness, she murmured, or something more. She returned to the house, her resolve firm. The earring was not just a jewel, but a key, and she would find the lock it opened. The morning was young, and there were others to speak with. Mrs. Winthrop, with her bright laugh and hidden debts, Mr. Goldman, with his craftsman's pride, and Ellen, whose silence spoke louder than words. Miss Marple's needles, when she took them up again, would click with purpose, each stitch a step toward the truth. Chapter 4. The Guest's Ambition. The breakfast room at Haverford Hall, with its tall windows and scent of fresh coffee, had dispersed its guests by mid-morning, leaving behind a faint air of unease. Miss Jane Marple, her black lace shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, lingered in the corridor outside. her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The conversation at breakfast had been polite but strained, and she had noted the quick glances exchanged among the remaining guests. Mrs. Clara Winthrop's laughter, bright and a touch too loud, had dominated the table. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes had caught the widow's nervous habit of touching her emerald brooch, as if it anchored her in the room's shifting currents. Miss Marple had decided to seek out Mrs. Winthrop next, sensing in her vivacity a thread that might unravel further. Found the widow in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with potted ferns and the heady scent of jasmine. Clara was seated on a wicker chair, her crimson morning dress a bold contrast to the greenery, a fashion magazine open on her lap. Her dark hair was swept up in a loose chignon, and the emerald brooch, pinned slightly off-centre, gleamed in the sunlight filtering through the glass. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her smile quick but not entirely warm. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Clara said, closing the magazine with a flourish. "Have you come to admire the flowers, or are you still playing detective?" Her tone was teasing, but her eyes held a flicker of wariness, like a cat watching a stranger approach. Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair opposite with the ease of an old friend. "A bit of both, perhaps," she replied, her voice gentle but precise. "The flowers are lovely, but I confess I'm curious about last night. Such a dreadful thing, to lose something so precious." She paused, her hands resting lightly on her knitting bag. "You were near Lady Beatrice during the ball, weren't you? Perhaps you saw something that might help." Clara laughed, a bright, brittle sound that echoed in the glass enclosure. "My dear Miss Marple, I'm hardly the sort to notice such things. I was far too busy enjoying myself, dancing, chatting, showing off my new brooch." She touched the emerald, her fingers lingering as if to draw attention to it. "Besides, I was nowhere near Beatrice when she lost her earring. I was with the mayor most of the evening, charming him into supporting my little charity project." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but unyielding. "Your brooch is quite striking," she said, her tone admiring. "A family piece, I presume?" She leaned forward slightly, as if genuinely curious, though her mind was already tracing the threads of Clara's story. Clara's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Oh no, not family," she said quickly. "A recent acquisition, actually. I found it in London, at a little shop off Bond Street. Cost a pretty penny, but worth every one, don't you think?" She tilted her head, letting the emerald catch the light. But Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hand, the way her fingers adjusted the pin as if it were unfamiliar. "It's lovely," Miss Marple agreed, her voice warm. "But you must have been close to Lady Beatrice at some point to admire her earrings so. She mentioned you complimented them during the quadrille." Her words were gentle, but they carried a quiet insistence, like a needle slipping through fabric. Clara's eyes narrowed briefly, then widened in a show of innocence. "Did I? Oh yes, I suppose I did. They were impossible to miss, sparkling like stars. But I was dancing, twirling about. You know how it is at a ball. I couldn't have been that close." She waved a hand airily, but Miss Marple caught the quick, glance toward the door, as if Clara were measuring her escape. "And after the quadrille?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone unchanged. "Lady Beatrice said you were near the cloakroom later, adjusting your brooch. It must be tricky, keeping such a heavy piece in place? Her eyes rested on the emerald, noting again its slight misalignment, as if it had been pinned in haste. Clara's laugh was sharper now, almost defensive. The cloakroom. Oh, I might have popped in to check my wrap. It was chilly by those French windows, and I didn't want to catch a cold. But I assure you, I wasn't fussing with anything other than my own things. She straightened, her posture suddenly formal. Really, Miss Marple, you make it sound as if I'm a suspect. I'd never dream of touching Beatrice's earrings. I have enough jewellery of my own. Her hand went to the brooch again, and Miss Marple's eyes followed the movement, noting the faint flush creeping up Clara's neck. Of course, Miss Marple said soothingly, her smile disarming. It's just that you have such a keen eye for beautiful things. I thought you might have noticed someone else near Lady Beatrice, someone who seemed out of place, perhaps. She tilted her head, her expression one of innocent inquiry. Clara relaxed slightly, sensing safer ground. Well, now that you mention it, I did see that maid, Ellen, is it, hovering about. She was always near Beatrice, fussing with her shawl or clearing glasses. A bit too attentive, if you ask me. Servants like that can get ideas, you know. Her voice took on a conspiratorial tone, but Miss Marple noted the deflection, the way Clara shifted suspicion elsewhere. Ellen does seem devoted, Miss Marple murmured, her fingers brushing the edge of her knitting bag. And Mr. Goldman, he was speaking with Lady Beatrice about the earrings, I believe. Did you notice him at all? Her question was casual, but her eyes were fixed on Clara's face, watching for any flicker of unease. Clara shrugged, her nonchalance a touch too studied. Oh, Felix. He's always talking about his jewels. He was probably just admiring his own work. He's terribly proud of those earrings, you know. Kept going on about their clarity and cut. But he was with Beatrice earlier, not when the earring went missing. She paused, then added, At least I think so. I was rather caught up in the dancing. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing Clara's words. The widow's quick dismissal of the jeweller, her eagerness to point to Ellen, and her constant touching of the brooch all formed a pattern, though not yet a clear one. Miss Marple knew from her village experiences that those who protested their innocence most loudly often had the most to hide. Clara's debts, whispered about in St. Mary Mead's tea rooms, were no secret, and her taste for luxury was evident in her dress, her manner, even the way she carried herself. As if wealth were a shield. Thank you, Mrs. Winthrop, Miss Marple said, rising with a smile. You've been most helpful. I shan't keep you from your magazine. She gestured to the forgotten periodical, its glossy pages splayed open to an advertisement for diamond necklaces. Clara laughed, a little too brightly, and returned to her reading, though Miss Marple suspected her eyes were not on the words. As Miss Marple left the conservatory, the scent of jasmine lingering in her wake, she paused in the corridor, her thoughts turning over like the pages of a well-read book. Clara Winthrop was a woman of ambition, her charm a carefully honed weapon, but her nervousness betrayed her. The emerald brooch, so proudly displayed, was a recent purchase, yet Clara's finances were known to be precarious. Could she have seen the earring as a solution to her troubles? And yet, her flamboyant nature suggested a lack of subtlety, not the careful planning a theft in a crowded ballroom would require. Miss Marple's mind drifted to the cloakroom, where she had found the frayed blue thread. Clara had been there, adjusting her brooch, or so she claimed. The thread pointed to Lady Beatrice's shawl, but it could also point to someone who had been close to it. Someone like Ellen, who had adjusted it, or Clara, whose presence in the cloakroom was too quickly explained, and Mr. Goldman, with his intimate knowledge of the earrings, remained a figure of interest, his professional pride perhaps masking a deeper motive. She made her way to the terrace, needing the fresh air to clear her thoughts. The morning was crisp, the roses in the garden still glistening with dew. Miss Marple stood by the balustrade, her eyes on the French windows where the scuff mark had caught her attention the previous night. It was a small thing, but small things, she knew, often held the key to larger truths. Clara's laughter, Ellen's silence, Goldman's sharpness, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of seeing its shape begin to emerge. She returned to the house, her steps light despite the weight of her thoughts. The next step was clear. She must speak with Mr. Goldman, whose expertise might reveal more about the earring's fate. And Ellen, too, warranted a closer look, her quiet demeanour a contrast to the glittering world she served. Miss Marple's knitting needles, when she took them up later, would move with purpose, each stitch a quiet promise to unravel the mystery of the missing diamond earring. Chapter 5. The Jeweller's Craft. The library at Haverford was a sanctuary of polished oak and leather-bound volumes, its air heavy with the scent of old paper and wax. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced above a long table where Mr. Felix Goldman stood, meticulously polishing a display case of jewellery. His wiry frame was bent slightly, his sharp nose almost touching the glass as he worked, his fingers moving with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime crafting beauty. The case held an array of sparkling gems, ruby pendants, sapphire rings, and a single pearl necklace that gleamed like moonlight. But Miss Jane Marple's attention was drawn to the man himself, whose presence seemed as calculated as the facets of his stones. Miss Marple entered quietly, her black lace shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. She had chosen this moment to speak with Mr. Goldman. Sensing that his expertise might shed light on the mystery of the missing diamond earring. Her conversation with Mrs. Winthrop had left her with questions. And the jeweller, with his intimate knowledge of Lady Beatrice's prized possession, was the next thread to tug. She paused near a bookshelf, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Goldman, who looked up with a polite but guarded smile. "Good morning, Mr. Goldman," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and unassuming, as if she were merely passing through. "What a lovely collection you've brought. It must be quite a responsibility handling such treasures." Her tone was warm, but her eyes were sharp, noting the slight tightening of his fingers around the polishing cloth. Goldman inclined his head, his smile professional. "A pleasure, Miss Marple, though not without its burdens. Each piece tells a story, and I'm merely its caretaker." His voice was smooth, with a faint trace of an accent. London, perhaps, polished by years of dealing with the wealthy. He gestured to the display case. "Would you care to see something? A brooch, perhaps, to complement your elegance?" Miss Marple chuckled, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm far too old for such finery, but I do admire your skill." Those earrings of Lady Beatrice's, for instance, they're quite remarkable. You made them, I understand." She settled into a chair near the table, her knitting bag resting on her lap, her posture one of innocent curiosity. Goldman's eyes flickered, but his smile held. "Indeed, I did. 2 years ago for Sir Henry. A pair of flawless 1-carat diamonds, teardrop cut, set in white gold. The screwback clasps were my own design, secure, elegant, impossible to lose accidentally." His tone carried a note of pride, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting shadow in his expression, as if the loss of the earring were a personal affront. "Impossible to lose accidentally," she repeated softly, her fingers brushing the edge of her bag. "That's most interesting. Lady Beatrice said you inspected them recently. Were you quite satisfied with their condition?" Her question was gentle, but it carried a quiet insistence, like a needle threading through fabric. Goldman nodded, setting down the cloth and clasping his hands behind his back. "I examined them a week ago, at her request. The diamonds were pristine, the clasps in perfect order. I tightened the screws myself, to ensure they wouldn't loosen, during the ball." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Which makes this disappearance all the more puzzling. A screwback clasp requires a deliberate twist to remove. It couldn't simply fall off." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind turning over his words. "A deliberate twist," she murmured, as if to herself. "So, either it was removed intentionally, or something quite extraordinary happened. Did you notice anything unusual during the ball, Mr. Goldman? You were near Lady Beatrice when she spoke of the earrings, I believe." Goldman's gaze sharpened, but his voice remained even. "I was, yes. We spoke briefly after her dance with Lord Harrow. She showed me the earrings, asked if I thought they suited her gown. I assured her they did." He smiled faintly, as if recalling the moment. "I was admiring my work, I confess. But I didn't touch them, if that's what you're implying. My hands were busy with my own display." He gestured to the case, where a sapphire ring caught the light, its facets winking like eyes. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Of course, I wasn't implying anything, but you have such a keen eye for detail. Did you see anyone else near Lady Beatrice? Perhaps someone who seemed overly interested in her jewellery?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were fixed on Goldman's face, watching for any flicker of unease. He hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the case. "Well, Mrs. Winthrop was nearby, chattering about her brooch. She's always showing off her latest acquisitions, though I doubt she could afford half of what she wears." His voice held a trace of disdain, quickly masked, and the maid, Ellen, I think, was bustling about, adjusting Lady Beatrice's shawl. "Servants are often closer than you think, aren't they?" He met Miss Marple's gaze, his eyes challenging, as if testing her reaction. "Indeed they are," Miss Marple agreed, her smile unwavering. "And you, Mr. Goldman, were you in the ballroom all evening? Or did you perhaps step out to the cloakroom or terrace?" Her question was casual, but it hung in the air. A gentle probe into his movements. Goldman's smile tightened. "I was in the ballroom mostly. I did visit the cloakroom once to retrieve a catalogue for a guest, but I wasn't there long, and I certainly didn't see an earring lying about." He straightened, his posture defensive. "Miss Marple, I deal in trust as much as in jewels. My reputation depends on it. I'd hardly risk it for a single earring, no matter its value." Miss Marple inclined her head. her expression one of perfect understanding. "Of course, Mr. Goldman. A reputation is a fragile thing, isn't it? Like a diamond, flawless until it's not." She paused, letting the words settle, then added, "You must see many fine pieces in your work. Do you ever find yourself tempted by them?" Her tone was almost playful, but her eyes were keen, watching the faint flush that rose to his cheeks. "Tempted?" Goldman laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Miss Marple, I handle gems worth fortunes every day. If I were the sort to be tempted, I'd have no business left. No, my interest is in the craft, not the possession." He turned back to his display case, his movements brisk, as if to dismiss the conversation. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand. "Thank you, Mr. Goldman. You've been most enlightening. I shan't keep you from your work." She smiled, her eyes lingering on the display case, where the jewels seemed to watch her in return. As she left the library, the door closing softly behind her, she felt the weight of Goldman's words, smooth as polished stone, but hiding something beneath. Outside, the hall was quiet, the morning light casting long shadows across the marble floor. Miss Marple paused, her mind sifting through the jeweller's account. His certainty about the clasp was compelling, yet it raised the stakes of the theft. A deliberate act required opportunity and motive, and Goldman, with his access to the earrings before the ball, had both. His disdain for Mrs. Winthrop's extravagance, his quick mention of Ellen's proximity, these were deflections perhaps, or clues to his own unease. And his visit to the cloakroom, however brief, placed him near the scene of the blue thread she had found. She thought of the village jeweller in St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Pym, who had once shown her a flawed emerald that looked perfect to the untrained eye. "It's the flaws that tell the story," he had said, and Miss Marple had never forgotten it. Goldman's story was flawless, but flaws, she knew, lay in the silences between words. His pride in his craft was genuine, but pride could mask greed or envy or something else entirely. Miss Marple made her way to the drawing-room, where she planned to sit and think, her knitting needles a steady companion. The earring's disappearance was a puzzle of human nature, and Goldman was but one piece. Mrs. Winthrop's nervous laughter, Ellen's trembling hands, Lady Beatrice's grief, they all formed a pattern, and Miss Marple felt its shape growing clearer. She would speak with Ellen next, the maid whose silence spoke volumes. As she settled into a chair, her needles began to click, each stitch a quiet step toward the truth, which lay hidden, like a diamond in the rough, waiting for her to uncover it. Chapter 6. The Maid's Disquiet. The servants' quarters at Haverford Hall were tucked away at the rear of the mansion, a world apart from the grandeur of the ballroom and drawing-rooms. The narrow corridor, lined with plain oak doors and lit by a single gas lamp, smelled faintly of starch and carbolic soap. Miss Jane Marple navigated it with her usual quiet grace, her black lace shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting bag a familiar weight in her hand. She had chosen this moment, late in the morning, when the household was settling into its daily rhythm, to seek out Ellen, the young maid whose nervous demeanour at the ball had caught her attention. The jeweller's polished assurances and Mrs. Winthrop's evasive charm had sharpened Miss Marple's focus on the girl, whose silence seemed to carry a weight of its own. Ellen was in a small scullery, Her slim figure bent over a pile of linens, folding them with a vigour that bordered on agitation. Her brown hair was pinned tightly beneath a cap, and her pale face, when she glanced up at Miss Marple's soft knock, showed a flicker of alarm before settling into a mask of deference. "Ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I help you?" Her hands paused, clutching a tablecloth, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremble in her fingers, a mirror of the nervousness she had observed the previous night. "Good morning, Ellen," Miss Marple said, her tone warm and unhurried, as if she had merely wandered in by chance. She settled onto a wooden stool near the door, her knitting bag resting on her lap. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I just thought we might have a little chat. It's such a distressing business, this missing earring, and you were so close to Lady Beatrice during the ball." Her smile was kind, but her eyes were keen, watching the girl's reaction. Ellen's hands tightened on the linen, her knuckles whitening. "I didn't see nothing, ma'am," she said quickly, her gaze dropping to the table. "I was just doing my duties, serving drinks, clearing plates, fixing her ladyship's shawl when it slipped." Her words were clipped, as if rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting an interruption. "Of course," Miss Marple said soothingly, her fingers brushing the edge of her knitting bag. "You're such a diligent girl, Ellen. Lady Beatrice speaks highly of you. 3 years in service here, isn't it? You must know the household well." Her tone was conversational, but there was a gentle insistence beneath it, like a thread being drawn through fabric. Ellen nodded, her movements jerky as she resumed folding. "Yes, ma'am, since I was 17. It's a good place, Haverford Hall." Her voice was flat, lacking the warmth of conviction, and Miss Marple's mind registered the discrepancy. In her experience, loyalty was often proclaimed loudly, but true devotion was quieter, and Ellen's words felt like a shield. "You were near Lady Beatrice during the waltz, weren't you?" Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but persistent. "When her shawl slipped. It must be difficult, moving through such a crowded room, keeping everything in order." She paused, her eyes resting on Ellen's face. "Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone lingering too close, perhaps?" Ellen's hands faltered, and a tablecloth slipped to the floor. She stooped to retrieve it, her movements quick and flustered. "No, ma'am," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was all a blur. Guests dancing, glasses clinking. I was just trying to keep up." She straightened, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment before dropping again. "I did see Mrs. Winthrop near the cloakroom, though, later on. She was fussing with her brooch, looked a bit cross, but I didn't see no earring." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Mrs. Winthrop does seem fond of her brooch," she said, her tone light. "And you, Ellen, you were in the ballroom all evening? Or did you step out to the cloakroom or terrace at any point?" Her question was gentle, but it hung in the air. A quiet challenge. Ellen's cheeks flushed, and she busied herself with the linens, her fingers moving faster. "I was in the ballroom, ma'am, mostly. I went to the cloakroom once to fetch a shawl for a guest, but I wasn't there long." Her voice was strained, and Miss Marple noted the way her shoulders tensed, as if bracing for a blow. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone unchanged. "It's such a busy night for the staff, isn't it? All those guests, all that finery. Lady Beatrice's earrings must have been quite a sight. Did you admire them when you adjusted her shawl?" Her eyes were soft, but they missed nothing. The quick intake of Ellen's breath, the way her hands froze for a moment. "They were beautiful, ma'am," Ellen said, her voice barely a whisper. "Like stars, they were, but I didn't touch them, I swear." Her words came too quickly, and Miss Marple's mind turned to a girl in St. Mary Mead, a housemaid who had once taken a silver spoon to pawn for a sick mother. The desperation had been in her eyes, much like the shadow in Ellen's now. "I'm sure you didn't," Miss Marple said kindly, her voice a balm. "But you're a perceptive girl, Ellen. You see things others miss. Was there anyone else near Lady Beatrice, someone who seemed out of place?" She leaned forward slightly, her posture one of gentle encouragement. Ellen hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. "Mr. Goldman was talking to her ladyship about the earrings," she said finally. "He was pointing at them, like he was showing off. And there was a gentleman, Mr. Percival, I think, standing close by, watching. But I didn't see nothing wrong." Her voice trailed off, and she resumed folding, her movements mechanical. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. Ellen's mention of Goldman and Percival added little new, but her hesitation, her quick denial of touching the earrings, spoke volumes. The girl was frightened, Miss Marple thought, not just of suspicion but of something deeper, something personal. She recalled a snippet of village gossip, overheard at the post office, about Ellen's sweetheart. A sailor named Tom, who had recently returned to St. Mary Mead. Young love, Miss Marple knew, could drive desperate acts, especially when dreams outstripped means. "You've been very helpful, Ellen," Miss Marple said, rising from the stool. "I shan't keep you from your work. It's a fine thing to serve a house like this, but it must be tiring, carrying so many responsibilities." Her smile was warm, but her words carried a subtle weight, and she saw Ellen's eyes flicker with unease. As she left the scullery, the corridor's dim light casting her shadow long and thin, Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. Ellen's nervousness was more than shyness. It was the fear of someone caught in a web of their own making. The maid's proximity to Lady Beatrice's shawl, her brief visit to the cloakroom, and her mention of Mrs. Winthrop's brooch, all pointed to a story yet untold. The blue thread Miss Marple had found in the cloakroom, frayed as if tugged, suggested a moment of haste or struggle, and Ellen's trembling hands could well have been involved. Yet Miss Marple was cautious. Ellen's motive was unclear, but the sailor's return hinted at dreams of escape, perhaps to a new life far from St. Mary Mead. A diamond earring, easily sold, could fund such a dream, but the theft required boldness, and Ellen seemed more timid than daring. Mrs. Winthrop, with her debts and flamboyant charm, was a more likely suspect for a brazen act, yet her nervousness suggested guilt of a different kind. And Mr. Goldman, with his craftsman's knowledge, could have tampered with the clasp before the ball, though his reputation seemed too precious to risk. Miss Marple stepped into the garden, where the noon sun warmed the roses and cast dappled shadows on the gravel path. She paused by the French windows, her eyes returning to the scuff marks she had noticed the previous night. It was faint, barely a smudge on the polished floor, but it nagged at her, a small discord in the evening's elegance. She thought of Ellen's quick movements, Mrs. Winthrop's evasive laughter, Goldman's guarded pride. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple felt its edges sharpening. She would need to observe more, to listen to the silences as much as the words. Ellen's fear, she suspected, held the key, but it would require gentle handling to unlock. As she returned to the house, her knitting needles beckoned, their steady click a promise of clarity. The missing earring was not just a jewel, but a mirror, reflecting the desires and fears of those around it, and Miss Marple was determined to see its truth. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Cloakroom. The afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the manicured lawns of Haverford Hall. But within its walls, the air remained charged with the unresolved tension of the missing diamond earring. Miss Jane Marple, her black lace shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, moved through the house with the quiet purpose of one accustomed to uncovering hidden truths. Her conversations with Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Winthrop, Mr. Goldman, and Ellen had woven a tapestry of motives and opportunities, yet the pattern was incomplete. The frayed blue thread she had found in the cloakroom lingered in her mind, a small but insistent clue that demanded exploration. She resolved to examine the cloakroom herself, sensing it might hold more than the discarded wraps of the previous night's guests. Miss Marple found Constable Harris in the entrance hall, his notebook open and his brow furrowed, as he conferred with a footman about the morning's fruitless search of the grounds. His youthful earnestness was evident, but so was his lack of method, and Miss Marple approached with a gentle smile. "Constable," she said, her voice soft but carrying a quiet authority, "I wonder if I might have a look at the cloakroom. It occurs to me that a lost earring might easily catch in a coat or shawl, and I'd hate to overlook such a possibility." Harris blinked, clearly relieved at the suggestion of direction. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, tucking his notebook under his arm. "I was just thinking we should check there again. The footman gave it a quick once-over last night, but they were in a rush." He led the way to the small room off the main corridor, his boots echoing on the marble floor. The cloakroom was a modest space, its walls lined with brass hooks, and a single gilt-framed mirror reflecting the dim light of a high window. A faint scent of lavender and mothballs hung in the air, mingling with the lingering traces of perfume from the ball. Most of the guests' coats had been reclaimed, but a few remained. Lady Beatrice's blue silk shawl, a heavy sable belonging to Mrs. Winthrop, and a gentleman's overcoat, likely Mr. Percival's, left behind in the evening's chaos. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting the orderly arrangement disrupted by a single hook, its edge splintered where she had found the blue thread. She knelt, her movements slow but deliberate, and examined the hook again. The thread was gone, likely swept away by the morning's cleaning, but the splintered wood told its own story. "This hook is damaged," she murmured, her fingers brushing the rough edge, as if something was caught and pulled. She glanced at Constable Harris, who was watching with a mix of curiosity and impatience. "Could be the shawl, ma'am," he offered, scratching his head. "Lady Beatrice said it slipped during the waltz, and Ellen fixed it. Maybe it snagged here later." His tone was hopeful, but Miss Marple sensed he was grasping at the simplest explanation. "Perhaps," she said, her voice non-committal. She rose and turned to the shawl, draped carelessly over a hook. Its blue silk was smooth, but a closer inspection revealed a tiny tear near the hem. The threads frayed in a manner that matched the splintered hook. "This is Lady Beatrice's, isn't it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Harris nodded, peering over her shoulder. Miss Marple's mind turned to the sequence of events. Ellen had adjusted the shawl during the waltz, a moment when the earring was still in place. Mrs. Winthrop had been seen in the cloakroom, fussing with her brooch, and Mr. Goldman had admitted to a brief visit to retrieve a catalogue. The frayed thread suggested a moment of haste, perhaps a struggle, but with what? An earring caught in the shawl, or something more deliberate? She recalled Ellen's trembling hands, Mrs. Winthrop's nervous laughter, and Goldman's guarded precision. Each had been near the shawl. Each had opportunity. She moved to Mrs. Winthrop's sable coat, its rich fur heavy under her touch. She ran her fingers along the lining, checking for hidden pockets or loose threads, but found nothing. The coat was pristine, though its weight seemed excessive for the mild evening of the ball. "Mrs. Winthrop was here, adjusting her brooch," Miss Marple said almost to herself. "I wonder what made her so particular about it." Harris shifted uncomfortably. "She's a flashy sort, isn't she? Always showing off that emerald. Maybe she was just primping." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Clara's insistence on her brooch, its slight misalignment, suggested more than vanity. Could it have been a distraction, a way to cover some other act? Miss Marple turned to the mirror, its gilt frame slightly tarnished. She tilted her head, catching her own reflection, and noticed a faint smudge on the glass, as if someone had brushed against it. "Constable," she said, "do you think someone might have stood here? Perhaps adjusting something other than a coat?" Her question was gentle, but it carried a quiet weight. Harris frowned, stepping closer to the mirror. "Could be, ma'am, but we didn't find anything last night. No earring, no pins, nothing." He paused, then added, "I was going to ask the staff if they saw anyone lingering here, but they're all so busy today." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already elsewhere. The cloakroom was a nexus, a place where paths had crossed. Ellen with the shawl, Clara with her brooch, Goldman with his catalogue. The splintered hook and frayed thread pointed to a moment of disruption, but the smudge on the mirror suggested presence, perhaps observation. She thought of Ellen's nervous denial, her mention of Mrs. Winthrop in the cloakroom, and Goldman's quick dismissal of his own visit. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. "Constable," she said, turning to Harris, "might we ask the housekeeper if any of the staff cleaned this room this morning? It would help to know if anything was moved or discarded." Her tone was polite, but her eyes were sharp, and Harris nodded eagerly, grateful for a task. As he left to summon the housekeeper, Miss Marple lingered, her fingers brushing the splintered hook once more. She thought of a village girl in St. Mary Mead, who had once hidden a stolen locket in a coat pocket, only to be betrayed by a torn seam. The cloakroom, she sensed, held a secret, but it was not in the objects themselves, it was in the actions of those who had passed through. Ellen's fear, Clara's evasiveness, Goldman's precision, they all converged here, in this small, lavender-scented room. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Gibbs, arrived with Harris, her apron crisp and her expression wary. "The cloakroom was tidied early, ma'am," she said in response to Miss Marple's question. "One of the girls swept the floor, but we didn't touch the coats or shawl. They're as they were left last night." She hesitated, then added, "Ellen was here, helping with the tidying, but she didn't mention finding anything." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Gibbs," she said, her voice warm. "You've been most helpful." As the housekeeper departed, Miss Marple turned to Harris. "I think we've seen enough for now, Constable, but it might be worth keeping an eye on this room. Things have a way of turning up when least expected." They returned to the main house, where the afternoon was slipping into a quiet lull. Miss Marple settled in the drawing room, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with a soft click. The cloakroom had given her a clue, but it was not the earring itself. It was the frayed thread, the smudge, the sense of hurried movement. She thought of Ellen's trembling hands, so close to the shawl, and Clara's insistence on her brooch, perhaps a cover for something else. Goldman's brief visit to the cloakroom nagged at her, his catalogue an excuse that felt too neat. As her needles moved, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads together. The earring's screw-back clasp, Goldman had said, required a deliberate twist. The theft, then, was no accident, but an act of intent, carried out in a moment of opportunity. The cloakroom was the stage, and its players, Ellen, Clara, Goldman, each had a role. But whose hand had pulled the thread, and why? She thought of Ellen's sailor, the whispered dreams of a new life, and Clara's debts, a burden that glittered like her emerald. Goldman's pride, too, could hide a deeper want. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting steady, her eyes distant. The truth was near, she felt, hidden in the small things, the frayed silk, the nervous glance, the smudged glass. She would watch and listen, as she always did, and the earring, she was certain, would reveal its thief in time. Chapter 8. A pattern emerges. By the third day at Haverford Hall, the grand house had settled into a restless quiet, its polished surfaces and hushed corridors unable to mask the lingering unease of the missing diamond earring. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her black lace shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the whirl of her thoughts. The morning had been spent in careful observation, her conversations with Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Winthrop, Mr. Goldman, and Ellen weaving a web of clues that now demanded careful untangling. The frayed blue thread from the cloakroom, the scuff mark by the French windows, and the nervous glances of those involved formed a pattern, and Miss Marple felt its shape growing clearer, like a familiar tune emerging from scattered notes. The drawing-room was bathed in the soft light of late morning, its tall windows framing the gardens, where roses nodded under a gentle breeze. Miss Marple's chair was positioned near a small table, where a tea-tray sat untouched, the porcelain cups gleaming with a faint sheen of neglect. She had declined breakfast with the other guests, preferring solitude to sift through the fragments of the mystery. Her knitting, a soft grey scarf destined for her nephew, progressed steadily, each stitch a moment to reflect on the human frailties she had glimpsed. Lady Beatrice's distress, she mused, was genuine, her attachment to the earrings rooted in memory rather than mere wealth. Yet the insurance policy, whispered about in St. Mary Mead's tea shops, was a tempting shadow. A woman of her standing might stage a loss to ease financial strain, but Miss Marple doubted it. Beatrice's grief had the raw edge of truth, and her pride in Haverford suggested she would not risk its reputation for a single jewel. Still, the possibility lingered, a faint discord in the melody. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, with her bright laugh and heavy emerald brooch, was a more complex figure. Her debts were no secret, her extravagance a topic of village gossip. The brooch, so proudly displayed, was a recent acquisition. Yet Clara's nervous gestures, her constant touching of the pin, its slight misalignment, suggested unease. Could she have seen the earring as a quick solution to her troubles? Her presence in the cloakroom, where the frayed thread was found, placed her near the scene, but her flamboyant nature seemed ill-suited to the subtlety of a theft in a crowded ballroom. Miss Marple's needles paused, then resumed. Clara was a possibility, but not the heart of the puzzle. Mr. Felix Goldman, the jeweller, was another thread. His pride in the earrings, his assurance that the screwback clasp required a deliberate twist, pointed to a deliberate act. His visit to the cloakroom, ostensibly to retrieve a catalogue, was too neatly explained, and his sharp eyes, always calculating, hinted at a mind accustomed to weighing value, perhaps not just in gems. Yet his reputation, as he himself had emphasized, was his livelihood. Would he risk it for a single earring, even one of his own creation? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Pride could mask greed, but it could also blind a man to opportunity. Ellen, the maid, was the figure who intrigued her most. The girl's pale face, her trembling hands, her quick denials, all spoke of fear, not just of suspicion but of something deeper. Miss Marple recalled a village girl, years ago, who had taken a silver candlestick to fund a brother's passage to Canada. The desperation in her eyes had been much like Ellen's, a quiet panic born of dreams too large for her means. The gossip about Ellen's sailor, Tom, recently returned to Saint. Mary Mead added weight to the theory. A diamond earring, easily sold, could buy a new life across the sea, but the act required courage, and Ellen's timidity seemed at odds with such boldness. Yet her proximity to Lady Beatrice's shawl, her brief visit to the cloakroom, made her a pivot in the pattern. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes distant as she considered the cloakroom. The frayed blue thread, caught on the splintered hook, suggested a moment of haste, perhaps a struggle. The smudge on the mirror hinted at someone standing close, adjusting or concealing something. Ellen had been there, tidying, as had Clara, fussing with her brooch, and Goldman with his catalogue. The scuff mark by the French windows, too, nagged at her, a small sign of carelessness in an otherwise meticulous evening. Each clue was a stitch, and Miss Marple felt the fabric of the truth taking shape. She rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and made her way to the library, where she knew Lady Beatrice would be meeting with Constable Harris to discuss the morning's search. The constable, when she entered, was standing by the fireplace, his notebook open, but his expression one of weary frustration. Lady Beatrice sat at a writing desk, her face pale but composed, the remaining earring glinting at her ear like a silent accusation. "Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, her voice warm but strained, "I'm so glad you're here. Constable Harris says they've found nothing on the grounds, not a trace of the earring." She sighed, her fingers touching the single diamond. "I'm beginning to think it's gone for good." Harris nodded, his round face flushed. "We've combed the terrace, the gardens, even the gravel paths. Nothing, ma'am. I'm thinking it's either inside or, well, taken." He hesitated, glancing at Miss Marple as if hoping for guidance. Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair. "It's a vexing puzzle, isn't it?" she said, her tone light. "But I've found that lost things often turn up where they're least expected. The cloakroom, for instance, such a busy place during a ball. I wonder if we might look there again with fresh eyes." Her suggestion was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching Lady Beatrice's reaction. The hostess nodded eagerly. "Of course, anything that might help. I'll have the staff leave it untouched until you've seen it." She turned to Harris, who scribbled a note. His enthusiasm rekindled. Miss Marple's mind was already moving ahead. The cloakroom was a nexus, but it was Ellen's behaviour that held the key. The maid's fear, her mention of Clara in the cloakroom, her quick denial of touching the earring, all pointed to a secret, perhaps one tied to her sailor. Miss Marple recalled a moment at the ball, when Ellen had paused near the French windows, her tray of glasses trembling. Had she been watching someone or something? The scuff mark, so near the windows, suggested a hurried step, perhaps a moment of distraction. She thought, too, of Clara's brooch, its emerald, a bold statement of wealth she could ill afford. The widow's debts were a motive, but her nervous gestures suggested guilt of a lesser kind, perhaps knowledge of something she dared not reveal. Goldman's expertise, meanwhile, made him a figure of interest, but his visit to the cloakroom felt too calculated, his story too polished. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind weaving the threads into a pattern, opportunity, motive, and the small telling details that betrayed them. She resolved to speak with Ellen again, this time with greater care. The girl's fear was a door, and Miss Marple knew how to turn the key gently. She would also watch Clara and Goldman, their interactions a mirror to their intentions. The earring, she was certain, was not far, hidden perhaps, but not lost. As she set her knitting aside, her eyes rested on the tea tray, where a single cup sat slightly askew, its handle turned as if by a nervous hand. "People are careless," she murmured, "but not always by accident." The pattern was emerging, and Miss Marple was ready to follow its threads to the truth. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Haverford Hall, casting a golden sheen across the drawing-room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with a quiet rhythm that belied the sharpness of her thoughts. The mystery of the missing diamond earring had woven a complex web, and her conversations with Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Winthrop, Mr. Goldman, and Ellen had revealed threads of motive and opportunity, each tangled with human frailty. The frayed blue thread in the cloakroom, the scuff mark by the French windows, and Ellen's trembling hands formed a pattern that Miss Marple now believed she could unravel. But belief was not proof, and she knew the truth required a gentle nudge to step into the light. Her mind, as always, turned to the small things, the glances, the hesitations, the objects out of place. Ellen's fear, so palpable in the scullery, suggested a secret tied to her sailor, Tom, whose return to St. Mary Mead had set tongues wagging in the village. A diamond earring, easily sold, could fund a new life. But Ellen's timidity made the boldness of such a theft seem unlikely, unless desperation had lent her courage. Mrs. Winthrop's nervous laughter and constant touching of her emerald brooch hinted at knowledge, if not guilt, while Mr. Goldman's polished assurances about the earring's clasp raised questions about his role. Lady Beatrice's distress, though genuine, did not entirely rule out the shadow of her insurance policy. The hued cloakroom, with its splintered hook and smudged mirror, remained the stage where these threads converged. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes resting on the tea-tray where a single cup sat slightly askew, its handle turned as if by a careless hand. The image sparked an idea, a way to test her theory without accusation. She had learned, in her years of untangling village intrigues, that people revealed themselves most when they thought themselves safe. A trap, subtle and unthreatening, might coax the truth from its hiding place. She rose, her black lace shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and sought out Lady Beatrice, whom she found in the library, reviewing accounts with a weary air. "Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but purposeful, "I've been thinking about your earring, and it occurs to me that we might try a small ruse to jog someone's memory or conscience." Her smile was gentle, but her eyes were bright with intent. Lady Beatrice looked up, her face a mix of hope and fatigue. "A ruse, Miss Marple? Whatever do you mean?" She set down her pen, the remaining diamond earring glinting at her ear, a silent reminder of her loss. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Suppose we announce that the second earring will be placed in the safe tonight, with Constable Harris guarding it. Let it be known that the combination has been changed to ensure its safety. If someone in the house knows more than they've said, they might be tempted to act, thinking the second earring is within reach." Her tone was calm, but her words carried a quiet weight, like a needle threading through fabric. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened. "You think someone might try to steal the other earring? But who? Not one of my guests, surely?" Her voice held a note of protest, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of doubt in her expression. "Not necessarily steal," Miss Marple said gently. "But curiosity or guilt can make people careless. If we watch closely, we may learn something." She paused, then added, "It would help if the staff were to hear of the plan, perhaps through a careless word in the servants' hall. Servants, you know, hear everything." Lady Beatrice nodded slowly, her resolve strengthening. "Very well, Miss Marple. I trust your judgment. I'll speak to Harris and arrange for the earring to be placed in the safe, and I'll ensure the staff know of it. Discreetly, of course." She rose, her posture more determined, as if the prospect of action had lifted her spirits. Miss Marple smiled, her mind already planning the details. She suggested that Lady Beatrice mention the new combination, a false one, of course, in the presence of the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, who was known for her love of gossip. Ellen, as part of the staff, would surely hear of it. And Miss Marple suspected the maid's fear might drive her to act. Mrs. Winthrop and Mr. Goldman, too, would be watching, their own secrets perhaps stirred by the news. That evening, as the household gathered for a subdued dinner, Lady Beatrice played her part with admirable poise. Over coffee in the drawing-room, she spoke loudly enough for the footman serving to overhear. "Constable Harris will guard the safe tonight," she said, her voice carrying a hint of nervousness. "The second earring must be protected, and I've changed the combination to be certain." She glanced at Mrs. Gibbs, who was arranging a vase nearby and added, "It's 1427.9, isn't it, Constable?" I do hope I've remembered it correctly. Harris, briefed by Miss Marple, nodded solemnly. "That's right, my lady. I'll be in the study all night, keeping watch." His tone was earnest, though Miss Marple noted the faint flush of excitement on his face, as if he relished the role. Mrs. Winthrop, seated near the fire, laughed lightly, her fingers brushing her emerald brooch. "How dramatic, Beatrice! It's like something out of a novel. Do you really think someone would try for the other earring?" Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, who met her gaze with a serene smile. Mr. Goldman, sipping his coffee, raised an eyebrow. "A wise precaution, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice smooth, "though I doubt anyone would be so bold. The first earring's loss was likely an accident, not a theft." His words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the quick glance he cast toward Ellen, who was clearing plates with downcast eyes. Ellen herself said nothing, her movements swift and silent, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands trembled as she lifted a tray. The maid's face was pale, her lips pressed tight, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. Fear, she knew, could drive even the timid to desperate acts, and Ellen's secret, whatever it was, weighed heavily. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple retired to her room, but not to sleep. She changed into a dark dress, her shawl replaced by a plain wool scarf, and slipped into the study, where the safe was housed behind a portrait of Sir Henry. Constable Harris, stationed by the door, started at her appearance. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "you're not supposed to be here." "Hush, Constable," she said softly, her eyes twinkling. "I'm merely an old lady who can't sleep. I'll sit in the corner, out of sight, and keep you company. No one will know." She settled into a shadowed alcove, her knitting in hand, the needles silent to avoid drawing attention. The house grew still, the only sounds the creak of settling wood, and the distant chime of a clock. At midnight, a faint noise broke the silence, a soft tread in the corridor, hesitant but deliberate. Miss Marple's eyes, accustomed to the dark, caught a flicker of movement as the study door eased open. A slim figure slipped inside, pausing to listen. It was Ellen, her face pale in the moonlight, her hands clutching a small cloth bag. She moved to the safe, her sure fingers trembling as she tried the false combination, 1427.9, her breath quick and shallow. Miss Marple waited, her heart steady despite the tension. Ellen fumbled with the dial, her movements growing frantic as the safe refused to open. A soft sob escaped her, and Miss Marple chose her moment. She lit a small lamp on the table beside her, the sudden glow making Ellen gasp and spin around. "It's not too late to confess, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice kind but firm. "You took the earring, didn't you? To help you and your Tom start a new life." Her words were gentle, but they carried the weight of certainty, and Ellen's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean no harm, ma'am," she whispered, sinking to her knees. "It was just there, when I fixed her ladyship's shawl. I thought it would get us away, to America. Tom's got dreams, and I couldn't bear to stay here, always serving." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple rose, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Where is it now, Ellen?" she asked softly. "The earring?" Ellen's hands shook as she opened the cloth bag, revealing a small tin box. "Under my mattress," she whispered. "I hid it there, waiting to sell it. I didn't know what else to do." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, pleading for understanding. Constable Harris, who had been watching in stunned silence, stepped forward, his notebook forgotten. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, then caught himself. "Miss Marple, you've done it." Miss Marple shook her head, her expression gentle. "Ellen has done it, Constable. She's told the truth, and that's a start." She turned to the girl. "Come, my dear. We'll fetch the earring and speak to Lady Beatrice. It's better this way." Her voice was a balm, and Ellen nodded, her tears slowing as she rose, clutching the empty bag. The trap had worked, not through force, but through the quiet pressure of truth. Miss Marple's needles, silent now, had woven the final stitch, and the pattern was nearly complete. Chapter 10. The Confession, the study at Haverford Hall, bathed in the dim glow of a single lamp, felt like a stage where the final act of a quiet drama had just unfolded. Miss Jane Marple stood beside Ellen, the young maid whose tear-streaked face betrayed both fear and relief. The girl's confession, prompted by the subtle trap of a false-safe combination, had laid bare the truth of the missing diamond earring. Constable Harris, his earlier flustered demeanour replaced by a mix of awe and determination, hovered nearby, his notebook clutched tightly as if it might anchor him in the moment. The air was heavy with the weight of revelation, yet Miss Marple's calm presence lent a sense of order to the scene. Ellen, still trembling, clutched the empty cloth bag in her hands, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I didn't mean to cause such trouble, ma'am," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was just a moment when I fixed her ladyship's shawl. The earring was loose, and it came off in my hand. I hid it in my apron, thinking of Tom and me, of getting away." Her words faltered, and she looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes pleading for understanding. Miss Marple's expression was gentle, her hand resting lightly on Ellen's shoulder. "I understand, my dear," she said softly. "Love can make us do foolish things, but honesty can set them right. Let's fetch the earring now, and we'll see what can be done." Her tone was kind but firm, and Ellen nodded, her tears slowing as she drew a shaky breath. Constable Harris, regaining his composure, stepped forward. "Right then," he said, his voice brisk but not unkind. "Let's go to your room, Ellen, and retrieve that earring. No fuss now." He glanced at Miss Marple, his expression one of gratitude tinged with disbelief. "You've a knack for this, ma'am. I'd never have thought to set a trap like that." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "It's only a matter of knowing people, Constable," she said. "They tell us more than they realize, if we listen." She gestured for Ellen to lead the way, and the trio moved through the silent corridors of Haverford Hall, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpets. Ellen's room in the servants' quarters was a small Spartan space, its single window overlooking the kitchen garden. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small chest of drawers were its only furnishings, the air carrying a faint scent of lavender from a sachet tucked among the linens. Ellen knelt beside the bed, her hands shaking as she reached beneath the mattress and withdrew a small tin box, its edges dented from years of use. She opened it with a soft click, revealing the diamond earring, its teardrop shape catching the lamplight and casting a prism of light across the plain walls. "There it is," Ellen whispered, her voice breaking. She handed the box to Miss Marple, who took it with care, her eyes resting on the jewel. It was as Lady Beatrice had described, a flawless diamond set in white gold, its screw-back clasp glinting with quiet accusation. Miss Marple turned it over in her hands, noting the absence of damage, the clasp still secure. It had not been forced, she thought, but taken in a moment of opportunity, just as Ellen had said. Constable Harris peered over her shoulder, his eyes wide. "That's it, all right," he said, his voice a mix of relief and triumph. "Good work, Miss Marple. We'll need to take this to Lady Beatrice at once." He reached for the box, but Miss Marple held it a moment longer, her mind tracing the final threads of the puzzle. "Let us go together," she said, her tone calm. "Ellen should be there when we return it. It's only right." She glanced at the girl, whose face was pale but resolute, and Ellen nodded, her hands clasped tightly before her. They found Lady Beatrice in the drawing-room, seated by the fire with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The remaining earring still adorned her ear, a solitary sentinel of her loss. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening at the sight of Ellen, whose head was bowed in shame. "Miss Marple, Constable," she said, rising. "What's happened?" Miss Marple stepped forward, the tin box in her hand. "We've found your earring, Lady Beatrice," she said gently, opening the box to reveal the diamond. "Ellen has something to tell you." Her voice was steady, and she placed a reassuring hand on the maid's arm, encouraging her to speak. Ellen's voice trembled as she began, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm so sorry, my lady," she said. "I took the earring. It was during the waltz, when I fixed your shawl. It came loose in my hand, and I kept it. I thought it would help me and Tom, my sweetheart, start a new life in America. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry." Her words spilled out, punctuated by soft sobs, and she sank to her knees, her hands covering her face. Lady Beatrice's face was a study in conflict, anger, betrayal, and a flicker of pity. She took the tin box from Miss Marple, her fingers brushing the earring as if to confirm its reality. "Ellen," she said, her voice tight, "you've been with us 3 years. I trusted you. How could you do this?" Her eyes filled with tears, not just for the earring, but for the breach of faith. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice a bridge between them. "She's young, Lady Beatrice, and in love. It makes people do foolish things, but not always wicked ones. She kept it hidden, not sold, and she's told the truth now. That counts for something, doesn't it?" Her eyes were kind, but they held a quiet plea for mercy. Lady Beatrice looked from the earring to Ellen, her expression softening. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "This earring, it was my husband's gift. To think it was taken so easily." She paused, then turned to Harris. "Constable, what must be done?" Harris cleared his throat, his authority tempered by the moment's gravity. "Well, my lady, it's theft, plain and simple. She'll need to face a magistrate. But seeing as she's confessed, and the earrings returned, it might go easier for her." He glanced at Miss Marple, as if seeking confirmation. Miss Marple nodded. "A word from you, Lady Beatrice, could make a difference," she said. "Ellen's mistake was born of desperation, not malice. A second chance might set her right." Her tone was gentle, but it carried the weight of experience, and Lady Beatrice's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Very well," Lady Beatrice said, her voice steadier. "I'll speak to the magistrate. But Ellen, you cannot stay here. You understand that, don't you?" Her eyes were stern, but there was a trace of compassion in them, and Ellen nodded, her tears falling freely. "Yes, my "Lady," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I'll go, and I'll make it right, I swear." She looked at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with gratitude, and Miss Marple gave her a small, encouraging smile. Constable Harris took the tin box, securing the earring in his pocket. "I'll see to the formalities, my lady," he said, "and thank you, Miss Marple. You've saved us a deal of trouble." He escorted Ellen from the room, her steps slow but steady, as if a burden had been lifted even as a new one loomed. Lady Beatrice sank back into her chair, the earring's twin still at her ear. "I don't know how you did it, Jane," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "You saw what none of us did." Miss Marple shook her head, her knitting bag in hand. "I only listened, Beatrice," she said. "People tell their stories in the smallest ways. A glance, a tremble, a thread out of place." Ellen's heart was heavy, and it showed. She paused, her eyes distant. "But the earring is back, and that's what matters." As she left the drawing room, the house felt lighter, as if a shadow had been lifted. The confession had closed one chapter, but Miss Marple knew the story was not yet complete. There were questions still about Clara's nervous brooch, Goldman's calculated visit to the cloakroom, and the scuff mark by the windows. They were loose threads, and she would tie them up before she left Haverford Hall. Chapter 11. The Threads Unravelled. The drawing-room of Haverford Hall glowed softly in the early evening light, its tall windows framing the gardens where the last roses of summer clung to their stems. The return of the diamond earring had lifted the pall of unease that had hung over the house, but a quiet tension lingered, as if the air itself awaited closure. Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her black lace shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles idle in her lap. Lady Beatrice had insisted on a small gathering to mark the resolution of the mystery, and the remaining guests, Mrs. Clara Winthrop, Mr. Felix Goldman, and young Mr. Percival from the neighbouring estate, sat in a loose circle, their faces a mix of relief and curiosity. Constable Harris stood by the door, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of quiet pride tempered by deference to Miss Marple's insight. Lady Beatrice, her sapphire gown restored to its elegance, wore both diamond earrings once more, their teardrop shapes catching the firelight with a serene brilliance. She held a glass of sherry, her smile warm but tinged with the weariness of the past days. "Miss Marple," she said, raising her glass, "I cannot thank you enough. You've given me back more than an earring. You've restored my peace of mind." Her voice was steady, but her eyes held a flicker of lingering hurt, the betrayal of Ellen's theft still fresh. Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile gentle. "I'm glad to have helped, Beatrice," she said softly, "but it was Ellen's honesty, in the end, that made it possible." Her words were kind, but her eyes swept the room, noting the reactions of the others. Mrs. Winthrop's laugh was a touch too bright, her fingers brushing her emerald brooch as if to anchor herself. Mr. Goldman's sharp features were composed, but his gaze lingered on the earrings with a professional intensity. Mr. Percival, a pleasant but unremarkable young man, seemed content to listen, his eyes darting between the speakers. Mrs. Winthrop leaned forward, her crimson dress vivid against the muted tones of the room. "Do tell us, Miss Marple," she said, her tone playful but edged with curiosity. "How did you know it was Ellen? I'd never have suspected that quiet little thing." Her hand rested on her brooch, and Miss Marple noted the slight misalignment. a detail that had nagged at her throughout. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folded in her lap. "It's a matter of seeing the small things," she said, her voice calm but clear, carrying the weight of quiet authority. "People reveal themselves in ways they don't intend. A glance, a gesture, a word out of place." Ellen's hands trembled when she spoke of the ball, and her eyes held a fear that wasn't just shyness. I've known girls like her in St. Mary Mead, driven by love or dreams to do things they later regret. She paused, her eyes softening as she glanced at Lady Beatrice. The earrings clasp, as Mr. Goldman told us, required a deliberate twist to remove. That ruled out an accident, you see. Goldman nodded, his expression one of professional approval. "Quite right," he said, his voice smooth. "The screwback design is secure. It couldn't simply fall off, which is why I was so puzzled." His eyes met Miss Marple's, and she saw a flicker of respect, but also a guardedness that suggested he was still measuring his words. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. "The cloakroom was the key. I found a frayed blue thread there, caught on a splintered hook, matching Lady Beatrice's shawl. It suggested a moment of haste, perhaps a struggle. Ellen had adjusted the shawl during the waltz when the earring was last felt in place. Her presence in the cloakroom, tidying, gave her opportunity. And her mention of Mrs. Winthrop there, fussing with her brooch, was a small deflection, but it told me she was nervous. She glanced at Clara, whose smile faltered briefly, her fingers tightening on the emerald. Clara laughed, a brittle sound. "Me? Oh, Miss Marple, you can't think I had anything to do with it. I was just checking my coat. It was chilly, you know." Her voice was light, but her eyes darted to the others seeking reassurance. Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Of course, Mrs. Winthrop, but your brooch caught my eye. It's such a striking piece, yet it was pinned slightly askew, as if adjusted in haste. I wondered if you'd seen something in the cloakroom, something that made you uneasy." Her words were gentle, but they hung in the air, and Clara's flush deepened. "I saw nothing," Clara said quickly, her hand dropping from the brooch. "Just Ellen, tidying, and that dreadful hook catching my sleeve. I told you, I was only there for a moment." Her tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the quick glance she cast at Goldman, as if seeking an ally. Goldman cleared his throat, his fingers tapping lightly on his glass. "The cloakroom was busy that night," he said, his voice even. "I was there myself, fetching a catalogue for a guest, but I saw no earring, and I certainly didn't touch Lady Beatrice's shawl." His eyes met Miss Marple's, and she saw a challenge there, as if daring her to probe further. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Indeed, Mr. Goldman, your expertise was most helpful. The clasp's design pointed to a deliberate act, and your visit to the cloakroom, though brief, placed you near the scene." But it was Ellen's fear that stood out most. "She spoke of her sailor, Tom, in the village, and I remembered a girl in St. Mary Mead who took a brooch to fund a similar dream. Desperation, you see, can make even the timid bold." Her eyes softened, but her voice held a quiet certainty. Lady Beatrice sighed, her fingers touching her earrings. "I still can't believe Ellen would do such a thing," she said. "But I'm grateful you saw it, Jane. And I've spoken to the magistrate. She'll face a fine, perhaps some time in service elsewhere, but not prison. I couldn't bear that." Her voice was firm, and Miss Marple nodded, pleased by the compassion. Mr. Percival, who had been silent, spoke up, his voice hesitant. "It's remarkable, Miss Marple, how you pieced it together. Like a puzzle, all those little bits fit in just so." He smiled, and Miss Marple returned it, though her mind lingered on the loose threads. Clara's unease, Goldman's guardedness, the scuff mark by the French windows that had yet to be explained. "You're very kind, Mr. Percival," she said, "but it's only a matter of listening to what people don't say as much as what they do." The earring was a mirror, reflecting what lay in people's hearts: love, ambition, pride. Her eyes swept the room, resting briefly on each face. Clara's smile was tight, Goldman's expression unreadable, and Lady Beatrice's gratitude tinged with relief. As the gathering dispersed, Clara rose with a flourish, her brooch catching the light. "Well, I'm off to pack," she said, her voice overly bright. "This has been quite the adventure, but I'm ready for quieter days." She laughed, but Miss Marple noted the haste in her movements, as if eager to escape scrutiny. Goldman approached Lady Beatrice, his manner professional. "If you'd like, my lady, I'll inspect the earrings' clasps before I leave. Free of charge, to ensure no further mishaps." His offer was gracious, but Miss Marple saw the calculation in his eyes, as if he sought to close the matter definitively. "Thank you, Felix," Lady Beatrice said, her smile warm. "That would be kind." She turned to Miss Marple, pressing her hand. "Jane, you must stay another week. Haverford Hall owes you so much." Her eyes were earnest, but Miss Marple shook her head gently. "You're too kind, Beatrice," she said, "but my garden in St. Mary Mead is calling, and I've a scarf to finish for my nephew. I'm happy to have helped." Her smile was serene, but her mind was still at work, tying up the final threads. The scuff mark by the windows, Clara's nervous brooch, Goldman's quick visit to the cloakroom. They were small echoes, but they no longer mattered. The earring was back, and Ellen's confession had laid the mystery bare. As she left the drawing-room, the firelight casting her shadow long and thin, Miss Marple felt the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. The truth had emerged, not through force, but through the quiet pressure of observation, and Haverford Hall could return to its rhythms. Her knitting needles, when she took them up later, would move with a contented rhythm, each stitch a testament to the power of seeing what others overlooked. Chapter 12. The Quiet Return. The train from Haverford Hall to St. Mary Mead chugged steadily through the countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing counterpoint to the whirl of events that had filled the past days. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her black lace shawl folded neatly in her lap, her knitting bag at her side. The green fields and hedgerows of late summer passed in a gentle blur, their familiarity a balm after the glittering tension of the charity ball and its aftermath. The diamond earring, now safely reunited with its twin on Lady Beatrice's ears, had revealed not just a thief, but the quiet truths of human longing. And Miss Marple's mind, though calm, lingered on the lessons of the case. Back in her cottage, the roses in her garden greeted her with a riot of colour, their petals heavy with the scent of late August. She settled into her favourite armchair by the fire, the familiar creak of its springs a welcome homecoming. Her knitting needles emerged, the grey scarf for her nephew resuming its steady growth, each stitch a moment to reflect. The village was already abuzz with tales of the ball, the theft and her role in its resolution, but Miss Marple said little, content to let the gossip weave its own embellishments. Mrs. Price at the post office had already declared it a scandal to rival London, and Miss Hartnell, with her usual flair, insisted the earring had been spirited away by a master criminal. Miss Marple smiled at the thought, her needles clicking softly. The case, she reflected, was not unlike her garden, full of small details that, when tended, revealed a larger pattern. Ellen's theft, born of a desperate dream to escape with her sailor Tom, was a story as old as St. Mary Mead itself. Miss Marple recalled a dairymaid from her youth, who had taken a silver spoon to fund a lover's passage to Australia, only to return it in tears when her heart broke. Ellen's remorse had been genuine, her confession prompted by the gentle trap of a false, safe combination, and Lady Beatrice's compassion had ensured a lenient sentence, a fine and a new position far from Haverford-Hall. The girl's future, Miss Marple hoped, would be kinder than her past. Mrs. Winthrop's nervous laughter and her emerald brooch, pinned askew, had been distractions, not clues to guilt. Her debts, whispered about in the village, made her a plausible suspect, but her flamboyance lacked the cunning for such a theft. The brooch, Miss Marple suspected, was a recent purchase meant to bolster her fading status, its misalignment a sign of haste rather than crime. Clara's quick deflection to Ellen in the cloakroom had been a moment of self-preservation, not conspiracy, and Miss Marple felt a quiet sympathy for the widow's struggle to maintain her glittering facade. Mr. Goldman, with his sharp eyes and polished manner, had been a figure of interest, his knowledge of the earring's clasp suggesting opportunity. His brief visit to the cloakroom, ostensibly for a catalogue, had raised a question, but his pride in his craft was too fierce to risk for a single jewel. The scuff mark by the French windows, which had nagged at her, was likely nothing more than a careless guest's misstep, a detail that had seemed significant but proved irrelevant. Goldman's offer to inspect the earring's clasps, free of charge, was a gesture of professionalism, not guilt, and Miss Marple had seen in his eyes a respect for her insight, however grudging. Lady Beatrice's insurance policy, a shadow of motive, had faded in the light of her genuine grief. The earrings were more than jewels. They were a link to her late husband, and her relief at their return was unfeigned. Miss Marple had noted the hostess's kindness toward Ellen, a mark of character that transcended wealth or status. Haverford-Hall would recover its rhythm, its grandeur undimmed by the brief scandal. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the cloakroom, where the frayed blue thread and smudged mirror had pointed to a moment of haste. Ellen's trembling hands, adjusting the shawl, had seized an opportunity born of desperation, the earring slipping into her apron in a fleeting act of courage. The scuff mark, the thread, the smudge, they were the small signs of human nature, the kind Miss Marple had learned to read in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. People she knew were much the same, whether in a grand hall or a village cottage, their hearts laid bare by their actions. She rose to make tea, the familiar ritual grounding her thoughts. The kettle whistled, and she poured the steaming water over the leaves, the scent of Earl Grey filling the room. As she sipped, her eyes rested on a letter from her nephew Raymond, full of his usual lively chatter about London. She would finish the scarf for him, she decided, and perhaps include a note about the earring, though she would keep it brief. Raymond loved her stories, but the village would have embroidered this one beyond recognition by the time he heard it. The diamond earring, she mused, was not just a jewel, but a mirror, reflecting the desires that drove Ellen to theft, Clara to pretense, Goldman to pride, and Beatrice to memory. Its loss had stirred the house, but its return had restored a fragile balance. Miss Marple's needles resumed their work, the scarf lengthening with each stitch, a quiet testament to her method, watching, listening, seeing the truth in the smallest things. As the evening deepened, the village settled into its familiar hush, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the soft chime of the church clock. Miss Marple glanced at her garden, where the roses glowed faintly in the twilight. Another puzzle solved, another thread tied, but she knew more would come. The post, she thought with a smile, always brought something new. A letter, a rumour, a mystery waiting to be unravelled. Her needles clicked, steady and sure, ready for whatever lay ahead.